About 50 years ago, I took up a search for God. I went to a different church every Sunday, checking them out, see if any of them made sense. I know I've told this story before, so I won't go too much into detail, but I came across some people who had used to be associated with Jehovah's Witnesses, and they took note of my interest in the Bible, and both of them gave me like a box of books and watchtowers going back all through the 60s and 50s. So that was my introduction to the teachings of the Watchtower. I devoured everything, and eventually one of Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on my door, and it was a young man that I knew from high school. We both just graduated. In fact, we used to sit next to each other in a class. Anyway, we started, the formal Bible study, and I started going to the congregation, and I was pretty worldly, and it took me a while to get, unimmersed. But I remember one of the first conventions, the first convention I went to was the International Convention. I grew up in Indianapolis, and the convention was down in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I didn't have a car at the time. I just had a motorcycle, and more often than not, it was in pieces on the garage floor. I was rebuilding, chopping it, or whatever. So, mind you, this is in the early 70s. So I wanted to go to this convention, and I didn't make any arrangements because I hadn't been going to meetings, but I'd heard about this. So I hitchhiked about 100 miles down to Cincinnati, and it was in their old riverfront stadium right on the Ohio River. But I didn't have a lot of money. I remember there's two girls that picked me up hitchhiking, and incredible. We ended up smoking a joint. So here I am going to the convention, talking to them about the Bible. Hey, you want to? Yeah, sure. But anyway, I ended up getting a room. It was like on Skid Row, some flop house, with a light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and I went to the convention every day. I don't know why I brought that up. Where was I going with it? Anyway, I eventually, they let me get baptized. And, I progressed and eventually became an elder and a pioneer and all of that. And in the mid-90s, though, 96, I started to see things differently a little bit, particularly as regards prophecy. Excuse me. But I still kept, going to meetings and out in service, and the fact I was still a pioneer. But by the new millennium, I was really seeing things differently, and I decided to publish some of my findings on the web. And in fact, I set up a website 20 years ago in 2002. Before I set that website up, though, I literally woke up one morning and I realized 1914, it couldn't be what the Watchtower says it is, that Jesus began ruling, Satan was cast down. And I know it's a powerful thing that, he had this chronology pointed forward to 1914, supposedly. But I realized it didn't hold up to scrutiny. And anyway, I won't get into that here because I've written quite a bit about it and done a video and so forth. But It's a powerful thing that, this war started, even though at the time, leading up to 1914, they expected total anarchy and Armageddon, the rapture, and all of that. And when that didn't materialize, then it was some years later that the Watchtower reworked everything and made 1914 the beginning of the kingdom rule, and Jehovah's Witnesses know how that goes. But anyway, when I realized that it couldn't be true, and then I realized what Paul was saying, that it's a delusion that God allows an operation of Satan to go to those who know the truth in order to test them. And right now, it's not a test, but of course, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that the sign of Christ's presence was visible when World War I started, because that was what Jesus said. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. And there'll be food shortages and pestilence and great earthquakes. So that is sort of, it's considered irrefutable. It's rock solid. If Jehovah's Witnesses question it, then they're considered weak in the truth, maybe, or apostate. Even though, it's an interpretation. It's not like, something as straightforward as what God's kingdom is, or the relationship between God and Jesus. No, but it is an interpretation. But anyway, when I realized that 1914 was not the beginning of the rule of God's kingdom, I do believe the Bible. So then I realized that means that the things that Christ foretold will occur in the future. In other words, Revelation, the 6th chapter, presents this scroll of God's judgments, and it's sealed with 7 seals. And what's the second seal? Peace is taken away from the earth so that they would slaughter one another with a great sword. Second seal, food shortages. Third seal, fourth seal, pestilence, and so forth. So realizing all of that was in the future, I, been on the watch, expecting a third world war. And those who've seen some of my videos or read the book, Jehovah himself has become king, or many of the other articles that I've written, I've expressed that anticipation that at some point in the future, there will be a war that will far surpass World War I and World War II. Well, in 2016, I thought, wow, Russia intervened in the Middle East. They were invited by the president of Syria to take care of Al-Qaeda and ISIS that the Anglo-American Empire was training and using to overthrow President Assad. So, boy, we've never really had the nuclear powers in direct conflict. And it looked like Russia's intervention in 2016 might lead to that. But they were very careful, surgically took out the encampments of the terrorists at the training grounds, and that was that. Well, now we've got another situation that is much more serious. And we have people in the world, observers, world rulers, talking about the seriousness of this conflict. And it's really a proxy war between the Anglo-American Empire and Russia. And now they're working hard to, provoke China and instigate something. So, the Secretary General of the United Nations said that a nuclear war was a possibility. and other observers have pointed out that this situation could easily spiral out of control and result in World War III. And not only that, but here we are, where this so-called pandemic is come and gone, and now there's a monkey pox virus. Well, pestilence, food shortage, that's the second one. Because of the turmoil in Ukraine, it's a big exporter of food, wheat primarily, and farmers are in uniform fighting, and they mine the harbor in the Black Sea, so grain cannot get to port anyway. And because of sanctions against Russia, their exports have been hindered, you might say. And not just foodstuff, but fertilizer. And in the United States, there's other things going on. They've shut down a primary railroad that brings fertilizer from Canada down to into the United States. And it's a critical time right now. Farmers are planting and because of the bankers agreeing to withdraw credit from, industries that produce greenhouse gases, which is everything that supports life on Earth. Now we've got this situation where diesel fuel is becoming unaffordable for truckers and farmers running the tractors. Fertilizer is becoming unaffordable. So what do we see here? We see the things that I've been anticipating: war, food shortage, and pestilence. And I don't think it's going to be more than a few more months, because the financial system is on life support as well. That's really what's driving the Anglo Empire, because China and Russia and India and the whole of Asia are developing a new economic system based on the Belt and Road Initiative, and developing third world nations in Asia and Africa. And it's an open invitation to all nations, which would really revolutionize the world. But the Anglo Empire won't hear of it. And so they're going to try to blow the whole thing up. And I think they'll be successful. And that will initiate what Jehovah's Witnesses imagine, have been deluded into thinking took place in 1914. So that will be a big test. The Watchtower says this, and they're Jehovah's faithful slave, God's spokesman. How could they be so wrong on something so important as the second coming of Jesus Christ? Well, I refer you to the 42nd chapter of Isaiah, and Jehovah poses a little rhetorical question. Who is blind as the servant of Jehovah? Who is as deaf as the messenger whom I send? Well, Jehovah's Witnesses claim to be witnesses for God, servants of God, messengers of God. And God says, who is as blind as my servants? Believing that Christ has come when he hasn't. That's pretty blind. So anyway, I realize that there's a lot of people that are not affiliated with Jehovah's Witnesses, maybe know a little bit about them. Maybe most of what they know is negative stuff, because over the last 20 years, a lot of unseemly, ugly stuff has come out. And, I've published a great deal about that as well, as how that is fulfilling prophecy. Listen, Jehovah does things in stages. At one time, God started off with Abraham's offspring, and they weren't very faithful to him. He put up with them for a long while, punished them severely when Nebuchadnezzar completely destroyed Jerusalem and the temple where Jehovah had placed his name, and drug the survivors off to faraway Babylon. But then Jehovah redeemed them, brought them back. They rebuilt the city because Jehovah wasn't finished with them at that time, because the Messiah was coming and he needed a place to be born into, a family, a nation, a people that were somewhat familiar with the scriptures. And some of them were looking for the Messiah at the time. And so that's how Christianity began in Jerusalem, in Judea. And then they fulfilled Jerusalem, Jewry, Judaism, fulfilled God's purpose. And 40 years from the time that Jesus was baptized, the Romans came 40 years later in the year 70, and it was a punctuation mark, an exclamation mark that God was finished with the nation. Sure, there's Judaism now, but Jehovah has nothing to do with it. He did in the past. He instituted Christianity. And it has gone through the same pattern, you might say, of unfaithfulness. After the apostles died off, Constantine inserted himself as the decider of who Jesus was, and eventually that corrupt form of Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. And from that sprang Catholicism and all the offshoots of Orthodox, and then centuries later, Lutheranism, Protestantism, and all the many sects. But like old Judaism, Christendom has fulfilled God's purpose to an extent. They sort of a placeholder, you might say. They've kept the Bible, even though they kept it from the people until Gutenberg invented the printing press. And now everyone has a Bible, and we can study God's purpose and educate ourselves and develop faith. And that's where Jehovah's Witnesses have come in. They're fulfilling another phase of God's purpose, which is to present these basic Bible truths of God's purpose. One aspect of God's purpose is to finish the calling of those who are going to rule with Jesus in heaven, which the Bible reveals to be 144,000. But another very interesting aspect of God's purpose is to gather a people who will survive the end of the world. Because the end of the world is not really the end of the earth. It's the end of Satan's dominion over mankind. So you might as well call it the end of the world. So Jehovah's Witnesses have educated people about that twofold aspect of God's purpose: to finish the calling and choosing of those who will rule with Christ for 1,000 years, and to gather a people who will survive the end. I like to just read one passage because I know people are worried about what's happening in the world. You don't have to be a Bible believer to see that there's some serious trouble brewing. You know, it's funny. Not funny, haha, but I was in a store the other day, the Tractor Supply, and there was some Amish men in the store, and I noticed that they always wear suspenders, and I was looking closely at them. They were ahead of me in the checkout line, and they were wearing blue jeans with suspenders, and their pants didn't have any belt loops. you'd need suspenders then, right? And so I got up to the lady behind the checkout counter after the fellas left, and I said, interesting, did you notice those men, they don't have belt loops on their pants? And she goes, yeah, I know. And I said, they must make their own clothes. Oh, yeah, they do, yeah. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, they're going to have an advantage, over us when the system collapses. I said that kind of check her reaction. And she didn't blink an eye. She goes, yeah, you're right. So it's not so far-fetched and crazy. In fact, a lot of people, they call it the prepper movement. They're preparing for the collapse of civilization. Of course, the Bible foretold that it would. The opening of the sixth seal is the collapse of civilization, what Jesus referred to as a great tribulation. And so what are we going to do? The rich people are building bomb shelters, stocking up food for a year. Is that going to do it? Well, the scripture I had in mind is in the Hebrew book of Zephaniah. And true, it originally was applicable to the people living in Jerusalem because Jehovah's judgment was coming against them. But it applies in a broader sense as well. So this is the second chapter, and it's God speaking. He says, gather together, yes, gather yourselves, O nation that feels no shame. Or a nation could be an organization, right? Before the decree takes effect, before the day passes by like chaff, before the burning anger of Jehovah comes upon you, before the day of Jehovah's anger comes upon you. Seek Jehovah, all you meek ones of the earth, who observe his righteous decrees. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. Probably you will be concealed in the day of Jehovah's anger. So he's not talking just to the Jews in ancient times, because he says, seek Jehovah, all you meek ones of the earth. He's speaking to Christians who have faith, who are looking to God. And so that's what we need to do. I get comments from people, why do you refer to God as Jehovah? Some Catholic monk made up that name back in the 1200s, Raimondi Martini or whatever. Well, that just ain't so. And for one thing, the letter J was not in use then. I think somebody came up with a name that would take, the Hebrews just abbreviated God's name, and all other words for that matter. They didn't use vowels in the ancient Hebrew. And God's name was represented by 4 letters, YHWH. And so there's only so many vowels, combinations, and so people call him Yahweh or Yiwah, but that Catholic monk didn't come up with the name Jehovah, because the J wasn't really invented in the English language until like the 1500s. In fact, the first English translation of the Bible by John Wycliffe, he used the name of God. He translated it into English, and it was, you wouldn't even recognize it. It was IEYOUAH or something, But when William Tyndale translated the Bible, more than 100 years later, his text was the basis, part of it, for what became the King James Bible. In fact, William Tyndale was executed for doing his translation. One of the last things he says, Lord, open the eyes of the King of England. And apparently that prayer was answered, and the king authorized a Bible to be translated into English, and they used the common popular form of Jehovah Now. And so that's the accepted English version. So if you're going to seek Jehovah, you better know his name. And it's not Jesus, as Jehovah's Witnesses will explain to people if they're meek and teachable. Unfortunately, many are not. But so, yeah, we're looking at some monumental events and twists and turns in the days ahead, and it is the best advice that I think anyone could give or follow is to seek Jehovah, seek meekness, seek righteousness, try to do the right thing, study God's word every day, try to help others if you're in a position to do so. And probably you'll be concealed in the day of Jehovah's anger. And it's coming. Thanks for watching.